The Catalian research vessel Gentle Current floated dead in space, somewhere between two distant star systems where no help would ever come. The ship looked like it was made from beautiful crystal, but that same beauty was now its curse. Tiny cracks were spreading across the hull like spider webs, and each crack meant death was getting closer. Chief Researcher Vexani pressed his face against the observation window, watching the stars that seemed so peaceful but were actually his tomb. His people, the Catalians, were nothing like the tough species that ruled the galaxy. They were delicate, almost like living glass sculptures. Their bones were clear and fragile, their skin translucent enough that you could see the strange blue fluid that served as their blood flowing beneath it. Everything had to be perfect for Catalians to survive. The air pressure, the temperature, even the humidity had to be exactly right. It's too much pressure and their bones would crack like breaking a wine glass. Too little and their soft organs would expand and burst like balloons. They were beautiful creatures, but the universe seemed designed to kill them. Life support at 30%, Mortal whispered from her station. Her voice was so quiet now because there wasn't enough air left to speak properly. She was young for a Catalian, barely past her first century, and her crystal-like features were dim with fear. Hull integrity is getting worse. Vexani closed his eyes and tried to remember better days. Days when their ship had been healthy and strong, when they had been exploring distant nebulas and discovering new forms of crystalline life, he thought. About his research, about the breakthrough they had made just days before the engine failure. All of that knowledge would die with them, lost forever in the cold emptiness of space. The ship groaned around them, a sound that made every Catalian aboard shiver with terror. Their hearing was incredibly sensitive, and they could hear every microfracture forming in the hull. It was like listening to their own death, approaching one tiny crack at a time. With shaking hands that looked more like thin glass rods than fingers, Vexani reached for the emergency communication panel. The controls were designed for their delicate touch, responding to the lightest pressure. He activated the ancient distress beacon, knowing it was probably useless but unable to give up completely. The emergency frequency he was using was old. Really old. Most modern ships didn't even monitor it anymore. It was a relic from the early days of space travel, back when species still helped each other. Now the galaxy was different. Everyone looked out for themselves, and the weak were left to die. As he transmitted their coordinates and species identification, Vexani felt a familiar weight of despair. In all of Catalian history, no one had ever answered their calls for help. Other species saw them as a burden, too fragile to be worth saving. Their rescue ships couldn't handle Catalian biology, and their military vessels had no use for such delicate allies. The distress signal pulsed out into the darkness, tiny electronic heartbeat in the vast emptiness. Each pulse used precious power from their dying systems, but Vexani couldn't stop himself from hoping. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe somewhere out there, someone was listening who actually cared. Around him. His crew of 12 researchers went about their final tasks with quiet dignity. They organized their data, wrote final messages to families they would never see again, and tried to make peace with their fate. The Gentle Current had been their home for 3 years, and now it would be their tomb. The ship continued its helpless drift through the void, carrying its fragile cargo of dreams and discoveries towards certain death. The distress signal kept pulsing, growing weaker with each transmission, calling out desperately to a galaxy that had never cared enough to answer. Captain Jake Miller sat hunched over his desk in the cramped quarters of the Iron Mountain, squinting at shipping manifests that seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Coffee stains decorated the papers like brown polka dots in his reading. Glasses kept sliding down his nose. The cargo hauler wasn't pretty, but she was reliable. And that's what mattered when you were hauling industrial equipment across the galaxy's most dangerous shipping lanes. The Iron Mountain was exactly what you'd expect from human engineering, big, tough, and built like a brick that could fly through space. Her hull was scarred from asteroid impacts and painted a dull gray that hid the welding patches. She wasn't winning any beauty contests, but she'd been Jake's home for 15 years, and he wouldn't trade her for anything. "Skip, I'm picking up." Something weird on the old emergency bands, Beth Rodriguez called out from her communications station. She was fiddling with her headset, turning dials that most ships had replaced with computers decades ago. Beth preferred the old equipment, said it could pick up signals that fancy new gear missed. Jake looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face creasing into a frown. At 52, he'd been running cargo routes since he was barely old enough to shave, and he'd learned to pay attention when his crew said something was weird. In space, weird usually meant trouble. Sounds like... Wait, this is definitely a distress call, Beth continued, her voice getting more excited. She was young for a communications officer, only 28, but she had ears like a bat and could pull signals out of static that would make a computer cry. Out here? Jake asked, pushing back from his desk. They were in the middle of nowhere, in a sector of space that most civilized folks avoided like the plague. What kind of ship? Beth shook her head, brown curls bouncing as she adjusted her. Equipment, unknown configuration, but they're identifying as ... Catalian? Her voice carried the kind of confusion you get when someone tells you they're from a place you've never heard of. Never heard of them. From across the small bridge, engineer Tom Walsh looked up from his coffee cup. Tom was the kind of guy who remembered everything he'd ever read, which made him invaluable on a ship where the manual for half their equipment had been lost years ago. He was built like a linebacker, but had the gentle hands of a surgeon when it came to fixing things. Catalians are those crystal folks, right? Tom said, scratching his graying beard. Read about them in xenobiology class back in the day. It's fragile as soap bubbles. Live in ships that look like they're made of glass. Jake walked over to the navigation display, his boots echoing on the metal floor. The holographic star map showed their current position as a blinking dot in a whole lot of nothing. They were already 3 days behind schedule because of engine trouble back at Proxima Station, and their cargo of mining equipment was needed yesterday on Kepler-44 to be, but that wasn't what really worried him. This sector was notorious for pirate activity, the kind of pirates who would gut a ship for scrap metal and leave the crew floating in space. Most merchant vessels traveled in convoys through here, but the Iron Mountain was running solo because Jake was too stubborn and too broke to wait for an escort. How far out are they? Jake asked, already knowing he was going to hate the answer. About 6 hours at full burn, Beth replied, still working her magic with the ancient radio equipment. Signal's pretty weak. It's bad. Jake stared at the navigation display for a long moment. His grandfather had been a merchant marine back on Earth, and his father had run supply ships during the Mars colonization. Both of them had drilled the same lesson into his head since he was old enough to understand. You always answer a mayday. Always. No matter what. The ancient maritime codes ran deep in human culture, deeper than profit margins and delivery schedules. Space was vast and cold and hostile, and sometimes the only thing standing between a person and death was the decency of strangers. Jake had been rescued himself once, 20 years ago, when his first ship had suffered reactor failure near Jupiter. Set course for those coordinates, he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of generations of sailors who had risked everything to save strangers in distress. Full burn. The Iron Mountain dropped out of hyperspace with the usual stomach-churning lurch that made Jake's coffee sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his mug. What he saw on the main screen made him forget all about his coffee problem. The Catalian ship looked like someone had taken a cathedral made of crystal and somehow convinced it to fly through space. It was beautiful in a way that made your breath catch, but it was also clearly dying. Sweet mother of pearl, Beth whispered from her station. That thing looks like it's held together with hope and good intentions. The gentle current was unlike anything in Jake's 20 years of space travel, where human ships were built like armored trucks. This vessel seemed delicate as a soap bubble. Its hull caught starlight and threw it back in rainbow patterns. But those same rainbow patterns showed stress fractures spreading across its surface like a spider web of doom. Scan shows 12 life forms aboard, Tom reported, his instruments painting the alien vessel in technical detail. But Captain, look at these atmospheric requirements, he whistled low. These folks need air pressure so precise that breathing wrong could kill them. Jake studied the readings, his frown deepening with each number. The Catalians needed atmosphere that was exactly 0.73 standard pressure, with temperature controlled to within 2 degrees and humidity that couldn't vary by more than 3%. Their own ship's life support was built for humans. Tough, adaptable humans who could survive in conditions that would kill most species. How do we get them aboard without killing them? Beth asked, already working on communication protocols to talk to the dying ship. Our life support would crush them like tin cans. We don't, Tom replied, and Jake could practically see the gears turning in his engineer's head. Tom was already moving toward his workshop, grabbing his toolkit with the practiced motion of a man who'd spent 30 years solving impossible problems. We build them a bubble. What happened over the next 6 hours was something that would have made alien engineers either laugh or cry, depending on their sense of humor. Tom Walsh, aided by the rest of the Iron Mountain's crew, performed what could only be called engineering magic using nothing but human stubbornness and whatever they had lying around. They started with spare environmental suits, the emergency kind that were designed to keep humans alive in hard vacuum. Tom cracked them open like eggs and started rewiring the life support systems, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle with the delicate electronics. He muttered to himself constantly, a stream of technical jargon mixed with creative profanity. That would have made a sailor blush. "Hand me that atmospheric processor," he called to Beth, was acting as his assistant while monitoring communications with the Catalian ship, "and grab those spare air scrubbers from cargo hold 3. The solution that emerged was beautiful in its complete lack of elegance. Tom had taken 3 cargo containers, the kind used to ship machinery, and welded them together into a rough habitat. The walls were lined with environmental suits torn apart and rebuilt into life support systems. Duct tape held together connections that should have been precision-engineered joints. Spare computer parts monitored atmospheric conditions, with sensors cobbled together from mining equipment. "This shouldn't work," Tom admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead as he made final adjustments. "According to every engineering manual ever written, this is impossible." But it did work. The makeshift habitat maintained exactly the conditions the Catalians needed, controlled by a computer system that Tom had built from spare parts and powered by a generator that was older than Beth. It looked like something a mad scientist had built in his garage. But the readings were perfect. Aboard the dying gentle current, Immortal watched the human work through their ship's sensors, their crystalline features reflecting amazement and something close to disbelief. "This is impossible," Vexani whispered, his voice carrying across the communication link. "No species builds like this. They're using primitive materials to solve problems our best technology couldn't handle." The Catalians had spent centuries developing elegant solutions to complex problems. Their technology was beautiful, efficient, and completely unable to adapt when things went wrong. They built crystal computers that were works of art. But when those computers failed, they stayed failed. The humans, on the other hand, seemed to approach every problem with the assumption that there had to be a way to fix it, even if that way involved duct tape and spare parts. The rescue was crude, inelegant, and completely effective. Everything that Catalian engineering wasn't. The journey to Epsilon Station took 3 days, and those 3 days changed everything Jake Miller thought he knew about the galaxy. The Catalians had been settled into Tom's makeshift habitat, which hummed and wheezed like an old air conditioner, but somehow kept working perfectly. Jake found himself spending more and more time talking with Vexani through the communication link, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the alien researcher had a way of speaking that reminded him of his old college professors. On the second day, as they were sharing what passed for dinner on both sides of the species divide, Vexani said something that made Jake nearly choke on his coffee. "Captain Miller, we must express our gratitude again," the Catalian said, his translated voice carrying that strange musical quality his species had. "In 800 years of spaceflight, you were the first to answer our distress call." Jake set down his mug carefully, sure he'd misheard. "Come again?" 800 years, Vexani repeated, and there was something in his tone that made the bridge go quiet. Even Beth stopped her constant tinkering with the communication equipment. "Since my people first left our homeworld, we have sent out 47 distress calls. Before today, the response rate was 0. The silence that followed was the kind that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Jake could hear the hum of the ship's engines, the whisper of air recyclers, and the distant sound of Tom cursing at something in the engine room. But mostly he could hear his own heartbeat getting faster.
Here.
Telling me, Beth said slowly, her sandwich forgotten in her hand, that in 8 centuries, nobody has ever helped you guys. We are considered inconvenient, Vexani explained, and his translated voice somehow managed to carry resignation that cut straight through Jake's chest. Too fragile to be useful in military alliances, specialized to be profitable as trade. Partners, our rescue requirements are ... complex. Most species file our SOS signals as navigation hazards to be avoided. Jake felt something cold and angry settling in his stomach.
How?
Navigation hazards. It is practical, Vexani continued, and Jake could picture him making those delicate hand gestures his species used when they talked. Rescuing Catalians requires specialized equipment, extended time and resources with no potential return. We understand the economics. Like hell you do, Jake growled, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Around the bridge he could see his crew's faces changing, expression shifting from surprise to something much more dangerous. Beth had stopped eating entirely, her face flushed with anger. You're telling me the galaxy just lets you die out there? Just writes you off as not worth the trouble? Tom had emerged from the engine room during the conversation, still holding a wrench and wearing his oil-stained coveralls. His usually cheerful face was dark with the kind of anger Jake had only seen a few times in their 15 years together. How many ships have you lost? Tom asked quietly. In the past 50 years, 17 vessels. 234 souls. Vexani's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was reading shipping statistics. It is simply the cost of exploration for our species. Jake stood up so fast his chair scraped against the metal floor. He started pacing, which was about all you could do in the cramped bridge of a cargo hauler when you wanted to hit something but couldn't find an appropriate target. 234 people, he repeated, his voice tight with control. Just left to die, because helping them wasn't profitable. Captain Miller, please understand, we do not blame the galaxy for its priorities, Vexani said, and somehow that made it worse. We are grateful for this rescue. It is more than we expected. Tom was already pulling up the galactic communication networks on his tablet, his thick fingers moving with surprising speed across the screen. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was about to do something that would probably get them all in trouble, but was absolutely the right thing to do. No, Jake said firmly, stopping his pacing to stare at the communication panel where Vexani's voice was coming from. No, you don't get to be grateful for basic decency. You don't get to accept that the galaxy thinks your lives don't matter. Catalians watched through their sensors as the human crew's expressions shifted from shock to anger to something far more dangerous, the kind of grim resolve that had carried humanity through ice ages and asteroid impacts and wars that should have wiped them out entirely. Jake Miller had filed plenty of reports in his 20 years of hauling cargo across the galaxy, but this one was different. He sat in his cramped quarters aboard the Iron Mountain, still docked at Epsilon Station, and tried to find words for what he'd witnessed. How do you explain to bureaucrats that an entire species has been abandoned by the galaxy? How do you make them understand that 234 people died not because space is dangerous, but because nobody cared enough to help? He filed the report at 0800 station time on a Tuesday. By Thursday afternoon, his personal communicator was buzzing with calls from people he'd never heard of. Admiral Chen from Fleet Command, from the Deep Space Rescue Service, even someone claiming to be from the Colonial Broadcasting Network wanting an interview. Jake, you need to see this, Beth called from the bridge, her voice carrying excitement and something that might have been awe. The main screen showed a news feed from Earth, and Jake felt his jaw drop. The headline read, Forgotten Species, How the Galaxy Abandoned the Catalians. Below it, his name appeared as the source, along with photos of the crystal-like aliens and their beautiful, fragile ships. But that wasn't what made his hand shake. It was the response. The Human Deep Space Rescue Service, which usually struggled to fund 3 ships for the entire Outer Rim, had somehow mobilized 50 vessels in less than 72 hours. The screen showed converted cargo haulers, retired military vessels, and even some civilian ships being retrofitted with the kind of life support systems Tom had built from spare parts and duct tape. "How is this possible?" Vexani asked through the communication link. He and his surviving crew were still living in Tom's makeshift habitat, waiting for proper transportation back to their homeworld. "Your species is committing enormous resources to help strangers." Jake looked at the news feed showing volunteers lining up at recruitment centers across human space. Engineers were working around the clock to develop standardized Catalian-compatible rescue equipment. Shipyards were retooling production lines to build vessels that could handle the delicate atmospheric requirements of crystal-based life forms. "Because it's the right thing to do," Jake said simply. Though he knew that didn't really explain the scope of what was happening, the galaxy's reaction was swift and predictable. Within a week, the Galactic Council had called an emergency session to discuss what they termed the human overreaction. Jake watched the proceedings on his personal tablet, anger growing with each pompous speech. Counselor Hector of the Vrex Dominion stood at the speaker's podium, his reptilian features twisted with disdain. "This is an inefficient allocation of resources," he declared, his voice echoing through the council chambers. "The Catalians offer no strategic military value, no profitable trade opportunities, no technological advantages. Humanity is wasting ships and personnel on a species that contributes nothing to galactic civilization." The human ambassador, Lisa Parker, rose slowly from her seat. Jake had never met her, but he'd heard stories. She was the daughter of a mining colony administrator, someone who'd grown up on the frontier where helping your neighbors wasn't optional, it was survival. "Counselor," she said, her voice carrying the kind of cold politeness that Jake recognized from his grandmother's generation. "You clearly don't understand humans. We don't help people because it's profitable. We help them because they need help." Her words spread across human networks like wildfire. Within days, Jake was seeing them printed on T-shirts, carved into ship hulls, and posted in recruitment centers across human space. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 months, human rescue ships had answered 17 Catalian distress calls. Each rescue was documented, broadcast, and shared across human communication networks. Jake watched videos of crystalline beings being carefully transferred. 2 human ships, their translucent faces showing wonder at the crude but effective life support systems that kept them alive. The Catalian survival rate in space jumped from barely 30% to over 90%, almost overnight. Ships that would have died alone in the void were being found and rescued by human crews, who treated their salvation like it was the most natural thing in the world. Other species watched this with bewilderment. The galaxy had functioned for millennia on the principle of practical self-interest. You helped allies who could help you back. You traded with species who had something you wanted. You ignored problems that weren't your responsibility. Humans seemed to operate on completely different rules. They were the Deathworlders, the species that had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and global wars by working together. Now they were extending that same stubborn compassion to strangers they'd never met. From a species that offered them nothing in return except gratitude, Vexani found himself appointed as the Catalian liaison to the Human Rescue Service, a job that didn't exist until humans created it. He spent his days coordinating rescue operations, sharing atmospheric data, and trying to understand the species that had saved his people. "Captain Miller," he said during one of their regular communications, "there is something about humans that puzzles me. You have a saying that explains your behavior, but I do not fully understand it." "What's that?" Jake asked. "Leave no one behind," Vexani replied. "What does this mean to your people?" Jake smiled, thinking about his grandfather's stories of old. Earth navies about his father's tales from the Mars colonies, about every human who'd ever answered a distress call in the dark. "It means exactly what it says," he told the Catalian. "No matter who you are, where you come from, or what you can offer us in return, if you need help, we'll find a way to give it." The galaxy was learning what that really meant one rescue at a time. Wretch Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.